But if you are a Christian and you're in business or whatever field that the Lord calls you, not only is it an opportunity for you to join that army of ordinary people that are making a dent in the world, it's an obligation of yours. That's what we're here for. We are called to make a difference. We are called to build God's kingdom on this earth. We are called to serve others.
Tim, Mike and I are so excited to have you on the 100X podcast because your life really represents exactly what we're trying to not only learn from personally, but share with those of our peers around the world that are interested in being the soil that Jesus talked about that produces 100-fold. And I know that you don't like to think of it that way, but as an outside observer of your life over many years, I can see the fingerprints of God using you and your choices to bless the lives of others. And there's a multiplier, isn't there, that when you follow God's call and you stick with it, it compounds. You get compounding return. And that's kind of where you are at this season. So, like you and I talked about a minute ago, Jesus compared our life to these 4 different soils. And he said, don't be the soil that's shallow or get strangled by the cares of this world or caught up in the deceitfulness of riches, which through God's goodness you've avoided. But be the soil that, as he said, represents people who hear the word and accept it, and then through the power of the Spirit of God produce this amazing impact in other people's lives. So we want to learn from you. And Micah, why don't you guide us into our conversation?
Well, Tim, this is fun for me today. I just want to personally thank you for your investment in me over the years. And it's fun to mentor guys you think so much of on a personal level. So thanks for doing this today. And this will be fun to ask you these questions. But if you can just start off, give a little background on you and your family and how growing up affected some of what you're doing today.
Happy to. And again, as I said before, thanks. It's an honor and privilege to do it with this podcast with 2 dear friends, people I respect and admire. And to the extent anybody could benefit from hearing my story, then I'm happy to kind of share it. But I've got a wonderful wife of 41 years and 4 grown kids and now 6 grandkids. And so life is full that way. And as of this week, all 6 of my grandkids will be living in Charlotte, which is where I call home. And so that's even better. And then I've got 2 more kids that aren't married yet that hopefully will produce a few more grandkids along the way. But rich life, very, very blessed. We've been in Charlotte now since 2005. Prior to that, we lived in Denver, Colorado, and that's where all our kids were born and raised. And I got into real estate in Denver and worked for a company called Trammell Crow Company for a number of years, and then left there and started my own development company out there and had it for many years. And God blessed us there. And I'll tell you, I got into real estate for one reason, because I wanted to make money. And I was not thinking about kingdom purposes when I got into it. And I would say I've got friends that were probably as driven as I was about making money, and it cost them a lot with broken relationships and divorces and so on. And by God's grace, I've been able to avoid that. And it hasn't always been easy, but I take no credit for that. And I wish I would have known 40 years ago, some of those lessons that I now know about how costly that trade-off is, that sacrifice is. But in any event, started a development company and did real estate development in and around the Rocky Mountains for a number of years, and then had a good career for 20 years. Had 4 kids. And when my 2 older kids were heading off to college, through a number of circumstances, my wife and I really felt led to relocate to Charlotte. Her parents were aging, and a lot of my brothers, I have three other brothers, and they had settled in the Charlotte area. And I didn't mention we have four kids, same spouse, but we had two children. Then we had, in God's perfect plan, we couldn't have kids for about 11 years. Then we had two more. So we've got quite an age span. And so we had two kids going into elementary school when we had two kids going into college. And we really wanted to raise the second set around family because we, through the benefits of wisdom gleaned over the years, we realized how important that was. And so we ended up shutting down my development business, moving to Charlotte, North Carolina, and we felt led completely by the Lord to do that. And in the rearview mirror now, after whatever 18 years, we could see his hand in that move, but it didn't make the move easy. It was a difficult couple of years, but Charlotte was home, and we were determined to make it home, and felt led here, and so we did. And again, part of it was interesting when we moved here. Again, I was just essentially closing down a real estate company and doing development out west. And I said, okay, my plan was to do development out here, but I said, I'll be open to whatever God wants me to do. And really, that's when I read the Halftime book initially, and started thinking about, okay, Lord, you may have something else in mind for me. My hands are open. And I called a friend of mine and said, hey, can you set up meetings with half a dozen nonprofits that I could meet with, and see if maybe there's something through some of these nonprofit leaders I might be led to lean in and do something. And I had some great meetings with nonprofit leaders that I would still call friends of mine today. But rather than feeling led to get out of the marketplace and get into the nonprofit world, I felt affirmed to stay in the business world and be much more purposeful about what I'm doing my business for. And it was kind of a baby epiphany a little bit for me. And then a few years later, met Lloyd and did the formal Halftime process. Lloyd, I think that was maybe 2010. I think I was in one of the first roundtable classes that you did, and spent a year sitting at his feet, learning through that. And really, again, in the middle of that process, really felt affirmed that, hey, I'm a business guy. I'm a marketplace leader. And I felt led to stay in the marketplace, but be much more purposeful about what I do and how I do it and who I do it with, and how I can bless my coworkers and my investors and my customers in ways that sometimes you can't even imagine.
And Tim, one of the comforting things that I witnessed in that process was that was really affirmed by your peers in that group. And, they heard your heart, that you'd kind of pushed all the chips in the middle of the table. You were willing to do whatever, but then they looked at and listened to who you really are and what makes you come alive. And to me, that's part of this 100x soil thing of hearing and accepting, right? Is to show up in neutral position and be listening, but then to have people around you who know you or getting to know you in a confidential way that can tell you what they see and and it's been proven out now over these last 12 to 15 years that this is exactly what you were created to do with this kind of platform, right? And so I just share that for our listeners, that if you can get surrounded by peers in a confidential, safe setting and have them listen alongside you and affirm what you're hearing, it'll give you staying power, right?
And I'm a get stuff done kind of guy. I don't take a lot of time to, unlike my dear friend Micah here, who is purposeful as anybody I know. I just see something that needs to get done and I lean in and do it. And for those of you out there like that, plug into Halftime and do one of these roundtables. This is a shameless plug for halftime, but it was really a rich time for me because I literally hit the pause button on life, for half a day a month, and dove in, to a deep and heavy discussion, about my life and its trajectory and the lives and trajectories of those in the small group with me. And it was just a rich time, and I'll be forever grateful for it.
Tim, give everybody a little bit of perspective on your business and shopping centers, multifamily, kind of like what you guys do in Charlotte and how that's evolved a little bit over time.
So I work with a company called Crosland Southeast. We're based in Charlotte. We've got a small office in Orlando and Eastern North Carolina, a few folks in Raleigh. I'm one of the two managing partners, and our company, I say, is a diversified developer of real estate. We build things as small. We have a very active single tenant development group where we're building convenience stores and Starbucks coffee shops and so on. And we've got a grocery anchor development group that does retail. We do a lot with Publix, for example, in the Southeast. We do market rate apartment development. We do affordable housing apartment development. We're starting now a new initiative where we're doing some affordable for sale townhome development. And then we do some other things, more ancillary self-storage and some medical office. But we do a lot of different types of development. We're more known for bigger multi-use and mixed-use developments where we can put apartment and office and retail all on one canvas and design it in a walkable, collaborative way. And that's kind of sort of how we built our reputation. We work geographically through the Southeast, pretty active in Northern Florida, on up through Georgia and the Carolinas. And we've done some things in Nashville as well.
Yeah, that's awesome. Talk about how you guys kind of, as you got interested, well, I think it'd be great of a lot of guys I know, you're one of the best of like using your influence and, that you've been given in Charlotte and putting teams together. And I think it'd be fun to tell people about kind of what you and your friends are doing in Charlotte and the inner city, and kind of how you started working on that and putting a team together to transform a whole area of town.
Well, that's an interesting and fun story for me to get into, and you'll have to keep me on point because I can ramble here. But so as Lloyd knows, a dear friend of mine and I, Mark Linz, both of us had young men that were reaching out to us saying, "Hey, could you meet with me regularly? Mentor me, whatever." And a lot of these young guys, I give them credit. They would take, an hour or two every week if we could give it to them. And we just didn't have the time. And I had 3 or 4 guys that I was trying to pour into, and Mark did as well. And we finally, got smart and said, let's make it easy on ourselves and see if we can put a group together and do it once a week. Because otherwise we just wouldn't have the time margin for it. And so we formed a group, which we called Q2. They're not quite in halftime yet. They're still in the second quarter, but they're starting to ask the right questions. And we met every week for 7 years with that group. And there were a bunch of great young guys. They started when we started, they were maybe in their early 30s, and now they're in their 40s. And we would start out by throwing questions out. Over the years, we sometimes did a Bible study book, and sometimes we did a different type of book. But in the first couple of years, all we did was throw questions out there and, like, what's it look like to compete Christianly in the marketplace? And then we would debate that ourselves for a number of weeks. And then we'd bring in like a sports pastor friend of ours to go talk more deeper biblical truths on Christian competition. And then another one, what does it look like to communicate well in your marriage? And we talk about that. We've got lots of lessons to share there and mistakes that we've made. And then we brought a guy that runs a well-known Christian counseling agency in town, a dear friend of ours, and he spoke for 4 or 5 weeks. Then we talked about biblical stewardship, and we brought the guy that runs National Christian Foundation in John Putnam, another dear friend of mine and Lloyd's. And so these guys were getting Hall of Fame, lessons, not necessarily from us, but from these experts that we brought in. And Mark and I got to learn along the way. And one of the questions that we threw out was, in the heels of, we had some protest riots on the heels of a young black man being shot in Charlotte. And so we threw out the question, what's a Christian businessman's obligation or responsibility in the social justice arena? And so we talked about and wrestled with that question for a few weeks. And then we didn't really find an expert to come talk to us about it. So we moved on. And I confided to Mark, I don't know, some months later, saying, I can't get that topic out of my head. It seems like, there's unfinished business that the good Lord wants me to do. And he said, I feel the same way. And so we reached out to a few other business colleagues of ours, and the theme was consistent. Everybody said, we want to do something. The first few meetings that we had were almost a joke, because we all had the same heartbeat about doing something, but what everybody was moved to do was so completely different. There was no unity on a vision. So it was kind of a circuitous, rocky start, but ultimately a number of us coalesced around a vision to do what we would call a place-based redevelopment, where we focused on a specific neighborhood in a lower income area in Charlotte, and trying to do kind of holistic ministry. And we just started leaning in, using our social capital and our checkbooks and whatever platforms that we had, to try to begin to make a dent in generational poverty there. And that ultimately had us founding a nonprofit, which we certainly didn't set out to do. And that nonprofit is Freedom Communities, and by God's grace, it's thriving now.
Tim, a lot of well-intentioned rich guys show up downtown and do more harm than good. So, and there are even books about toxic charity and when helping hurts. How did you inform yourself so that you could build the teams wisely, so you could build strategies that weren't going to be harmful, at the end of the day, disappointing to everybody?
Well, that's a great question. And, we ask ourselves, in fact, I'm still board chair, and I met with the executive director, Hannah Beavers, who's phenomenal. I met with her today. In fact, spent a couple hours. We asked ourselves that question: how do we know we're effective? How do we know we're making a difference? And those are basic, fundamental business questions, but we ask that at every board meeting and all the time, because we're not interested in just feeling good about it. We actually want to elicit change, and so that's something that's been important to us from the beginning. I'll tell you one thing that we heard early that has really stuck with us. We hired we wanted a data-driven, research-based methodology, and so we hired a young guy that was getting a PhD in the cyclical effects of generational poverty. He was a pastor, a white pastor, David Dukeson, a dear friend. And we essentially hired him for 6 months to fly around the country and study the best examples of place-based redevelopment. And he went to Chicago and Detroit and DC and Atlanta and Orlando and other places. And he came back saying there's a number of different ways to do it, but the ways that seem to be the most effective, the places that are doing it more effectively, all trace the roots of their model to purpose-built communities, which is a nonprofit started many years ago in East Lake, Atlanta. And so we spent a day down at East Lake, Mark Linz and I and David and a few others, and learned from them. And and they basically said, if you want to dent generational poverty, people need affordable housing. But they need quality education. They need access to healthcare, and they need jobs. So education, housing, employment, healthcare. And if you want to really make a dent, you got to do all of those things. You can't just do one. And one of the things we asked the executive director, of Purpose Built, do a lot of churches get involved with this work? And she, without missing a beat, she said, well, churches do more harm than good. And we said, wait, what? And her comment was, there are a lot of churches that, somebody has an idea about doing something. So they start a committee, they get a few people. So they got a champion who gets a few people on board, and they go lean into some initiative in some lower income community. And then the next year, the champion, moves on, and the church, interest wanes, and, they start and stop, and they overpromise and underperform. And she said, this is generational work. This isn't a quick fix. There's no easy button. This work is 10, 20, 30 years long. And if you're not interested in doing it for the long haul, then don't start. And because you're actually going to do more harm than good. And so Mark and I were really convicted by that. And we said, are we willing to commit, for a decade or two? And the two of us looked each other in the eye and said, yeah, we're serious about it. We feel, like the burden we've got in our hearts is a divine burden, not a temporal one. And so if the good Lord wants us to do something, he's gonna, he wants us to lean in and do it until we see the end of it. And so, and without that commitment, we would have folded up shop a number of times over the years, because it's hard work, and there's lots of disappointments along the way. But if you stick with it, we've seen the fruits of that work just lead to life transformation, and that's very, very satisfying.
And Tim, frame up the big idea for our listeners of what it is you're doing and how wraparound services, and then then we can go deeper.
Yeah. So the big idea was, if you're going to try to dent generational poverty, as I mentioned before, and this is not anything we invented, the Purpose Built folks, I think, built the model 30 years ago or whatever, 25 years ago. They said, you've got to do education. You've got to have access to quality schools. You got to have affordable, attainable housing. You've got to have access to jobs and job training and so on. And then you've got to have access to healthcare. And so we kind of sort of adopted a neighborhood in West Charlotte and set about to look at some of those things. And I would say the mistake we made early was we tried to do all things that, the need is unlimited, and our budget was very limited and our time was very limited. And the mistake we made early was diluting our efforts. And so we finally got a little smarter and said, okay, even though all four of those are important, education and housing are the two most critical things. And so one of the early things we did was we convened a summit of the principals and some of the senior teachers in the area, elementary schools, public schools around there. And we sat down, bought them lunch, scheduled 90 minutes, and we said, hey, what do you need? Because, and I'll say this gets personal for me. I've got a couple of my oldest grandkids are in first and second grade, and they love reading to me, and I love it when they read to me, and they're reading already in first and second grade. There's a statistic, a metric that is a powerful one, third grade reading literacy. So as kids move up into and through third grade, they learn how to read. After third grade, you read to learn. So if you leave third grade and you don't know how to read, the chances of incarceration go up 10 or 20 times. The chances of, difficulties in life, kind of multiply. And so the goal would be 100% of third graders going into fourth grade, with the ability to read. And in West Charlotte, the number was 15.6%. So we're saying, okay, more than 4 out of 5 kids can't read when they leave third grade. Why? the ignorant Tim Sittema back then was thinking, okay, the teachers are bad, or the principals are bad, or the school's facilities are bad. And I would have been wrong. I was wrong on all of those accounts. The teachers were dedicated. The principals were dedicated. I'd have sent my grandkids to those schools. But the problem is, they said, and this is the teachers tell us, and the administrators saying, if we get a child in school in August, and if she or he is still in school in May, they will learn, and they will eventually be reading by third grade. The problem is, that's the exception. Most of the kids, start in August, and 6 kids leave in September, and 4 more leave in November. And the problem is, a lot of single parent households, and mom gets sick, misses work, gets fired, misses a rent check, gets evicted. And the kids are the victims, because they have to go to a different school district, and they end up losing, what could be a whole entire year of school, and they never catch up. And so we started pouring into that, and education, housing, employment, healthcare. Well, I'm a real estate guy. I was the only real estate guy involved. So I said, okay, housing, that's real estate. How hard can that be? Well, it can be, it can be very, very difficult. And so we ended up hiring a few people and starting a team to do affordable housing development. And I spend a good half of my time doing that now. We built, we've got over 500 families now in affordable housing, and we've got about another 500, about 200 more under construction, another 300 more on the drawing boards. And so, we're trying to make a difference in the affordable housing space. Again, using our talents and treasure to try to make an impact on a acute community need.
Tim, I don't think people listening have any perspective on how hard it is from going to be like a shopping center developer to affordable housing. And I mean, you're obviously such a gifted guy, but I think it's fun to watch how you've seen a need and been like, all right, we'll just, start affordable housing. That's a problem. And I just have so much respect for that. And can you talk about some of the learning lessons that you guys have had, you and Mark? Some of the wins and some of the challenges of getting this going, and for people that have interest in trying to do something similar in their town?
One of the key things, and Lloyd is really quick to point this out when we talked in the past, is, I wouldn't have done it by myself, and either would Mark. I mean, the strength of having a team equally committed to the same cause is absolutely invaluable. There were plenty of times where I was ready to throw in the towel, and Mark talked me off the ledge, and I hopefully did that to him for a few times, and there were other half timers that were involved in the work, and so if you could build a team of like-minded individuals, I think that would certainly be one of the key lessons. Another mistake I mentioned already, I'll repeat it again, is with a holistic scope of work, that's very, broadly encompassing education, housing, employment, healthcare. The needs in these lower income, underinvested communities are so great that it's very easy to dilute yourselves. And so one of the quotes I really like is, you can't boil the ocean all at once. You got to start a bucket at a time. And we finally, after a couple of years, realized that we were still trying to boil the ocean, and we got a lot better at saying no, even though there was plenty of good work that needed to be done. We couldn't do it all, and so we had to be a lot more disciplined about what were we capable of doing, and realistically, what were we incapable of doing. And so we started building on that, and as our staff grew, we were able to say yes a few more times, but early on we said no more than we said yes, as we were in the formative years trying to build the organization.
And Tim, you didn't exit your work in order to be able to do this. Instead, you've been leveraging the platform, the cash flow, the credibility, the relationship with banks. In fact, you even sign personal guarantees still on behalf of some of these 1,000 families that you're helping to lift out of. I mean, that's when it gets very personal, right? When you put pen to paper on a personal guarantee on a loan for affordable housing, whether it costs you something in the moment or not, it personal guarantees are very costly. So talk about that a little bit.
Well, it's interesting. You're exactly right. I didn't leave the real estate world. I doubled down on it. And it's interesting. And Lloyd knows this. I get I always get a little emotional talking about this, but I was just trying to do what I felt the Lord put a burden on my heart. So I wanted to do this affordable housing, and I'm not a very smart guy, but I'm pretty determined. So I said, all right, how hard can it be? And I just was a dog with a bone and just went after it. But what was interesting, and I drug my partners along with it, because I said, hey, I'm going to do this, whether we do it under the Carlson Southeast brand or on my own, I'm going to do it. But here's why I think we should do it under the Carlson Southeast brand, because, and I gave some fairly compelling business reasons. And I've got partners that are philanthropically minded as well. And so they said, all right, this is your baby. We don't want to take any risk, and we don't really want to lose any money. But if you can break even, then I think it's a good use of time. And so I ran with it, hired a few folks, and now after 5 years, 6 years or so, we've just crossed into the break even mode. We had to fund it for a number of years, but and I'm taking the recourse on personally. But what was interesting is the benefits that our company have gleaned from this work are almost immeasurable. We had great relationships with political leaders in Charlotte because we've been very active. But once we lean into this affordable housing space, those relationships amped up 10x. As one example. A second example, we always had an opportunity to hire great people. Now we had an even better opportunity because people were seeking us out because they saw a company that obviously cared, because we were doing stuff that they knew was difficult and challenging. And so we were able to attract even better talent in our organization, with people that are thrilled to be, joining arms with us, doing this stuff. Some of these folks that work with us don't even work in the affordable space. They just want to work for a company that cares. And so, I mean, those are just two specific examples of God's favor, because we were being obedient and doing this work. So, there is a cost. I like to say, God keeps score differently than we do, and I'm clearly not making as much money with the half of my time that I spend on the affordable housing space than I could doing almost anything else. But God keeps score differently than we do. And I would encourage, one day all of us are going to have to stand before him and give an account of what we did with the time and the talents and the treasure that he entrusted to us. And so I think it took me a number of years, but I finally realized that there's a whole lot more to life than just trying to make, a fatter balance sheet and a bigger checking account.
Tim, before we started recording, you were telling a story about, the football coach in Memphis and him driving through North Memphis saying somebody ought to do something about that. Why don't you share a little bit about that and your thoughts behind that?
That's interesting. So this is rather new, but there's a gentleman named Bill Coughlin who I'm looking forward to meeting here in a couple of weeks. But Bill is a white guy and he lives in Memphis, and he was a football coach, and he had heard about a all African-American high school that had a dismal record of 4 wins and 98 losses over the prior 10 years. And And he says, I'm driving through Memphis, and this is on he's got a podcast that he's doing, which I'll get to in a second. But he says, he's driving through these areas, he's seeing this depressed areas and the hopelessness and despair. And he says, somebody ought to do something about that. And he says, as if the sentiment itself actually meant anything. And he said, what you ought to do, and I'm quoting from him, what you ought to do is turn your rearview mirror down to 15 or 20 degrees, look yourself in the eye and say, I ought to do something about that. And so he did. He volunteered to be the head coach of this school, and over 7 years, basically turned the program around and poured himself into these young kids. And now he's doing a podcast, which is called An Army of Ordinary People. And he's basically saying, the politicians, aren't getting this stuff done, these intractable social problems, and the civic business leaders aren't getting it done. We need an army of ordinary people. And what I was saying was, you don't have to be a Christian, to lean in and do great work. But if you are a Christian, and you're in business or whatever field that the Lord calls you, not only is it an opportunity for you to join that army of ordinary people that are making a dent in the world, it's an obligation of yours. That's what we're here for. We are called to make a difference. We are called to build God's kingdom on this earth. We are called to serve others. And if we're not doing it, then we need to be asking ourselves, are we living out our true calling? And so I think it took me a number of years. I'm embarrassed to say I was a lot older than Micah was when I figured it out, but I'm glad that that God grabbed my heart, because I'm having more fun professionally. I'm working harder and having more fun, and I'm more fulfilled, and I feel that I'm more in the center of God's will and purpose for me now than I was for those 20 or 30 years when I was just chasing the bank deposits.
And Tim, I've been to the Tuck Opportunity Center that you and your team and your buddies bought and turned into several things. One being expanding a great literacy program for preschoolers, and then the Moms Moving Forward program. So in addition to a stable home environment for 1,000 families, and growing, God willing, over the coming years, there's this support to help the moms, often single moms, and the little guy and little gal trying to get to read at reading level by grade 3. So talk about those two programs before we kind of move to the second part of our program.
Sure. So the lines blur between my role at Crosland Southeast and the work I do at Freedom Communities, and I love that. So I can go from one for-profit apartment meeting to an affordable housing meeting, and then a team meeting at Freedom Communities, and not everybody may have the calendar flexibility that I have, but it's a true joy for me to be able to do that. Like today, I've had several Freedom Communities meetings and some other business type meetings. But when we were trying to do our data-driven approach to try to be an agent of change in West Charlotte, one of the things we did was we met with some of the different schools. One in particular was a charter school that was helpful sharing some of their data, and they were looking at their third graders and who could read and who couldn't read. And there was a cluster of third graders that were quite proficient at reading, whereas all their classmates were not. And they studied them. This is the movement school done by Casey Crawford, who's a great friend of Lloyd's and mine. And they discovered that these kids that could read well in third grade all trace their roots back to a preschool in the neighborhood called the Bright Future Learning Center. And so I said, boy, I gotta meet these people. And it's an African-American couple that had been toiling in obscurity in West Charlotte for decades. And so Miss Gloria is her name. And I sat down with Miss Gloria, and she probably doesn't even remember this initial meeting, but I said, wow, this is fantastic. Her husband and her own this preschool, and they operate it well. And I said, boy, can you expand? Oh no, we've been waitlisted for years. You can't add any more students? No, we're full. Well, could you open a second location? She said, no, we don't have any money for that. And I said, well, set aside the money issue. If that was solved for you, could you open a second location without hurting the original location with staff and so on? She said, oh yeah, I know who would run it for us and all that stuff. And so right away we said, all right, we've got a job to do. And so, because the West Charlotte area, it's called a daycare desert. There's not enough daycares and preschools for these kids. And so that was one of the key education initiatives that we had identified early. And so we went out, and again, the Lord, showed himself there. One of our guys found a church that was just closing, and they were going to sell this old church. So we quickly put an offer in, and they got 11 offers, and ours was the worst, the lowest offer and the longest close, because we had to raise the money. But ours was the only one that was going to save the church and do something for the community. All the rest of them were developers that were going to tear the church down and do townhomes or housing or whatever. And the church took our offer. They made us pay a little bit more and close a little faster, but still, they said, we were blessed when we bought this church a number of years ago, and we want to bless you guys to do that. And so again, thank you, Lord. So we had to go fundraise, and we bought this church, and we did a remodel in the church. And now we've got there's about 85 kids, I think, in the preschool. And if you ever want to, if you feel down and out, go walk through that preschool in the morning and see these kids, and you'll leave there with a smile on your face. So those kids now have an opportunity that they wouldn't have had in the neighborhood. And then we also started a program for the moms of these kids, not just those kids, but others in the neighborhood. If you're a single mom in the neighborhood in West Charlotte, we started a program called Moms Moving Forward, where we have cohorts of up to 15 moms. And those cohorts get together for a year. We actually pay the moms to attend some of these meetings, and then we build a curriculum around a lot of the things that those moms need in the neighborhood, like kind of financial literacy and resume skills. And it's all, of course, founded on a foundation of faith, which permeates all the curriculum that we study, but parenting skills and all these different types of things in need. And then these moms, most of them start with no bank account and poor credit, and they graduate with a stable housing typically and a bank account and much better credit and the ability to do some things that they never could before. And they feel those cohorts become friend groups and support groups, because all those folks are dealing with the same toxic trauma, brought on by poverty. And so we continue to course correct as we build. I think we're in our 6th or 7th cohort. We typically run about 3 cohorts a year. And so it's a 2-generational approach where we're working with the moms and then their kids, trying to kind of leave no child left behind, so to speak, in terms of the educational opportunities for those children.
Thank you for listening to the 100X podcast. Please subscribe to the show on your favorite podcast service. We would greatly appreciate it if you could rate the show and leave us a review. This podcast is sponsored by Anchor Investments, whose mission is to build America's most generous real estate company. To learn more, please visit anchorinv.com.